Hello there everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to take a look at how important post-processing is in visual arts, and we are going to turn a render like this one into something like this. So if you want to find out more about this quick and easy process of turning something like this into something like this, then just stay tuned for the video. So last week we've taken a look at how we can create an abstract animation like this one. And it seems that a lot of you really enjoyed that video, and I'm glad about that. So if you wanna learn how you can create this exact animation, then make sure to check out that video. However, today, as I said, we are going to see just how important post-processing is. And post-processing is the process of altering images in order to enhance the look of them. So things like color grading, color correction, making sure your histogram is in the right places, making sure that the color values are fine, especially compositionally wise. All those things will account for a lot in your final product. So, for instance, whatever your image looks like when you finish rendering it, that's called a raw render. And you don't just want to share that raw render online or call that your final render, because that's really just a base. So there's a lot you can do afterwards to really enhance and make sure that the final product looks so much better than what it is when you take it out of Blender or whatever 3D software you are using. So what I want to do today is take a couple of raw renders, or basically renders, that one is from me and another one I got from someone else, some other people, and I'm just pretty much going into Photoshop, and we are going to see what my post-processing process looks like with pretty much every render that I work on. So let's jump into Photoshop and see what we have there. Alright guys, so we are now inside Photoshop, and this is exactly what I open up after I finish a render inside Blender. So for this first example, I'm actually going to use this render, which is actually the render that we have worked on last week. So as I said, if you want to check out how you can create something like this, just make sure to check out last week's video. Alright, so this is pretty much my post-processing process, so to say. So just get the raw render, drop that in Photoshop, and this is where I start. So I've got my image over here, and the first thing I always do is right click this and convert this to a smart object, and this way all the effects and filters that I'm putting onto this image won't really get applied directly onto the image, and I'll have the option to take those out or do a bunch of other stuff. So pretty much working with a smart objects is a really non-destructive way of working. And so, make this a smart object, and then the next step is always to go into filter and get a camera raw filter. And this is where all the magic happens, really. We are gonna go through all of those, and by the end of it, this render will look a million times better. Alright, so first of all, what I like to do with my renders is to turn everything into black and white. And the reason I do black and white is because the first thing I want to make sure that I get right in my post-processing stuff is the exposure. So exposure is pretty much how bright things are, in a oversimplified way of saying it. And the reason I go into black and white is because black and white makes it a lot easier to focus only on brightness values, so exposure in a way, rather than having colors there to distract me. So go black and white, and this is a histogram. This basically represents the brightness values of this image. So a good exposed image will have values from all the way from here to here. So that's what we call a well exposed image. An underexposed image looks kind of like this one. It has a really big peak on the left where the shadows and blacks are, and pretty much nothing or little stuff on the right where the highlights and the bright stuff sits. Differently though, an overexposed image, something that's way too bright, will have a peak on the right and then just goes down the more it goes to the left. So pretty much it looks like this but mirrored. So if I go the exposure all the way up, this is how an overexposed image looks like. And you can tell when an image is underexposed, overexposed, or well exposed, even if you don't see the image. So if you don't have access to seeing that image, I can just look at this histogram and I can tell exactly that this image is pretty overexposed, and without even seeing the actual image, I know it's not well exposed. So let's go back to this view and put this back to 0. And what I want to do now to create a kind of well exposed image of this is to go over here in the middle. So if you see, if I put my mouse over here, it says exposure, and then we have shadows and blacks over here and highlights and whites over here. So what you want to do right now is get your mouse here in the middle where it's exposure, and you are gonna click and drag this to the right in order to make this histogram cover more space and not be all sitting here on the right, on the left where the blacks and shadows are. So I click on the exposure and I drag this up. I also check how the image looks. I don't want to overexpose this visually, even if the histogram says something. You should keep an eye on the image as well. So just play around with this and make sure you get some good covering with this histogram. After this step, you can pretty much go back into color, or you can work in black and white as well. I like going back to color after I'm done with that. I think I lower the exposure a bit, so something like this. And now I want to get into highlights and shadows. That's always the second thing I do after exposing this. So I want to turn down the shadows a bit in order to get some more details in there, and grab some more shadows, turn this up a bit in order to get some more details. Now don't worry if it's looking a little bit too washed out, because we are gonna go into curves next and we are gonna add a bunch of contrast in order to make this look nice again, because right now it is pretty flat. All right, what you want to do next is play with the whites and the blacks, and what you want to do with this is pretty much move this slider. So you see you have those two arrows here, which pretty much tells you that highlights are clipping or shadows are clipping. If you get shadows clipping, that means that your shadows are so black that they become perfect black, pitch black actually, and you don't want that, because pitch black means there's no information, it's just black color. And the same happens with highlights. When your highlights are clipping, they become pure white, and pure white has no detail in that. So what I want to do is go with the whites back and only move it to the right until this black arrow changes colors, and that's telling me that there's a bit of clipping somewhere in there. And the reason you want to make sure that both blacks and whites go to a point where they are starting to clip is because that way you make sure you have brightness values and color values all the way from 0 to 1 basically, and you are covering the entirety of the histogram, which is what you want. Now I'm gonna get the vibrance down a bit. I don't like my render super saturated. That's a personal choice of mine. You can do whatever you want with the vibrance, but I generally like to lower the vibrance. Now I'm moving on into the curves, and you can do two things in here. So first of all, you can do the same thing with the blacks clipping by basically taking the black point and moving that to the right, and as you can see, the darks get a lot stronger. And the same way you can do the whites by dragging this to the left, and you're pretty much changing the white point. I don't want to do that because we already taken care of this through whites and blacks. So what I want to do now is create a simple S curve. You know, the S curve, the general S curve, to add a little bit of contrast to our render. So I'm clicking over here and turning this, dragging this down like this, and I'm making another point in here to get some highlights back up like this. Alright, so something like this looks alright. And what I wanna do now is take the black point and go up a bit with it in order to create that washed out look. You know what I'm talking about. So I'm just gonna drag that up a bit, not too much, so something like this. And now I've got a pretty nice contrast in my image, and it doesn't look flat anymore. Next, I don't really use this, and now I go into HSL adjustments. HSL standing from hue, saturation and luminance, and I really like this tab because it gives me a really big control over specific colors and the way they look. But before we do that, I forgot to take in account temperature and tint, and this is something I play around. So basically it just adds blues and yellows or greens and magentas to your render. So based on whatever look and feel you want to give to your render, you're gonna use those two parameters. So I want this to be a bit more bluish, so I'm taking the temperature down a bit, and I want to get some greens in there. So the tint, I'm gonna go into the negative values, and as you can see now the colors have changed pretty drastically, and I like how this looks way more. So going back into these adjustments, and pretty much what I do here, there's no science, there's no formula. I just take the first slider, move it like this, and see what it affects and how it looks. So for instance, if you can see how those bokeh effects change colors when I do this, and I don't like this, so I'm gonna go a bit to the right and take out some reds from the reds basically. Now I'm gonna go into the oranges and do the same thing. So I'm moving this back and forth to see exactly what it changes, and then I'm gonna go and take an artistic decision. Do I want to take this to the left? Do I want to take this to the right? Do I want to leave it alone? That's a decision you make basically. So I'm just gonna move this ever so slightly to the left to get some more reds into the oranges, and now do the same with the yellows. You see what it does, and I think I'm gonna make the yellows a little bit greenish in order to keep this color scheme. Now the greens, not much changes in here except for this area. So as you can see, it changes ever so slightly, and I'm gonna keep this a bit into the blue hues. Now the aquas, I'm gonna do the same with those. I wanna move this to the left in order to get a little bit of a greenish blue, like that. Now we have the blues, and I think I'm gonna keep this as it is. And now purples and magentas we don't really have in our render, so we are not gonna see much difference when we move those. Now moving to saturation, and basically you want to use all those three options in order to manipulate the colors and their saturation and their brightness in order to create something really visually pleasing and balanced. So, you know, saturation for the reds, I want to take some saturation off. The oranges, I think I'm gonna saturate those a little bit more. Yeah, something like that. I really want the orange in this part to be the main thing that keeps your eye in there. Alright, so we have yellows. Yeah, I'm just gonna desaturate the yellows pretty much. Let's see what the greens are doing. They don't really do much. I don't want to change those. The aquas, I'm gonna take out some of the saturation, and I'm going to saturate the blues just a tiny. And now I'm moving into luminance, and I'm going to use luminance in order to tell the image and the colors, all right, I want these colors to be a little bit darker because I want to balance that out with some lighter, brighter colors that will be the main focus. So we have the reds, so I'm gonna turn the reds down a bit. Now we have the oranges, and I'm gonna let the oranges be as they are, and I'm gonna move into the aquas, and I'm gonna darken those and the blues as well. So what I'm doing right now, so the background is pretty much blue, while the foreground has a lot of orange and red elements, and I want to keep the background and the foreground separated. And the way I do this is by making sure that whatever is in the foreground, so basically those that are using reds and oranges, are brighter than the stuff that's behind, which contain blues and aquas, basically. So I'm gonna keep this tab and those settings like this, and I'm going to move into split toning. And what split toning is, it's pretty much adding a color into your highlights and a color into your shadows. And the way I like to work with those is to exaggerate the look and the effect, to then take it out and add it a bit by bit. So what I mean by that is I do the saturation 100 to see exactly the color that I'm choosing and the way it affects the image. So I'm just browsing the hues until I find something that looks interesting. So I like this kind of teal color, and now that I found the right hue, I'm gonna take the saturation down to 0, and I'm only adding it bit by bit until it starts to look interesting. So the same thing I do for the shadows then. Saturation 100, I search for a hue that I like, and then saturation goes back to 0, and we are adding some of that back in. So perhaps something like this. And now you can play with the balance as well. So you want more highlights or more shadows, as you can see. And I'm gonna get the balance to go up a bit. Yeah. Next thing, we have lens correction, and sometimes I use the distortion here, or sometimes I don't, but for this specific image I've used some of distortion, and what I've done was basically go like this and then just crop out the image to fill out the canvas. So I'm leaving this like this, and in the effects tab I have grain. So I'm zooming in. Grain, let me tell you this, so grain is really good for your renders. When you render something, you have that back in your mind that you want to get this perfectly clean without any artifacts or noise into your render, and that's perfect. But then in post-processing you want to add back some grain into your footage, because it will look more like it has been shot with an actual camera and it's not created in CGI. So I zoom in and I'm just adding some grain till it looks interesting. So you can see this is 0 grain, and especially in this material it looks CGI, it looks 3D, it looks like it's coming out and being rendered on computer. But once I add a little bit of grain, it starts to look like an actual photograph. And this is a really subtle thing, but really adds a lot to your render. I usually add vignetting as well, but I'm gonna do that after I crop the image. So moving on to the last tab, I don't use this, it's something called presets, and I've never used this, so I don't know about that tab. But basically we have calibration, and calibration lets you change the way primary colors, so the RGB colors, are displayed. So if I go like this, for instance, you see how much the colors have changed. You can play around with this and further enhance your image. You know, you play with the hues and the saturation till you get something more appealing to you, perhaps. So I'm gonna go, you know, like this. Just play around. There's no magic formula. You just gotta try stuff out and make sure you get the look you want. Yeah, right, I'm gonna leave the greens like that. And you play with this. This doesn't really do that much, so I'm gonna leave it alone. And now just press OK, and look how drastically our render has changed. And as I said, the reason I turned this into a smart layer is because now I have those filters right down below. And if you don't turn this into a smart object, you won't have this. All those effects will get applied to the image. And the great thing about smart objects is, so let's say I want to change a little bit of the settings that I've just added. You can just double click this, and no, you can just double click this. So this on the bottom where it says camera raw filter, you can just double click this, and now you get this back with all the settings that you've done. You can modify them and pretty much change the stuff. So this is before, this is after. Right now I'm going to press C and just crop this until it fits the whole image like this. Exactly. Press enter, and we have this image right now. So once again, this is before, this is after. And yeah, this is pretty much my process when I do post-processing over the renders that I work on. I usually add some particles, some textures around lens flares in here as well, but I'm not gonna cover that in this video. Now let's move on to the next example. So I was browsing Reddit the other day and I came upon this render that someone did. I'm gonna leave his name here. And you know, this is a simple render. It's not much to it, but this is looking really flat. And as I said, a lot of times post-processing is gonna help to make your enhance your image, or if you don't get something right in your actual render, you can post-processing will just save your ass. That's all I'm gonna say. So what we want to do right now, first I want to make sure that everything is lined up. So I'm looking at this house, and as you can see, it's a little bit crooked. So I'm gonna add a guide in here, and I'm going to rotate the image until the house is pretty straight, because now the image looks like someone was holding the camera wrong. So I'm adding I don't know what it's called, like the pivot over there, and I'm just gonna do this, and now the house is straight, and I'm just going to crop the image like this. All right, and this already looks better because we've taken out some of that dead space over there where nothing was happening. We can now focus more on what really matters, which is this house in the middle. And compositionally, this is better already. But now let's go through the magic of post-processing once again. Alright, I'm back, and this is the final result over here. And I'm just gonna go okay, and look how much of a difference we have. So we've taken this render from a really flat and really uninteresting lighting condition into this, which is so much better, and it'll definitely grab a lot more attention than this. Alright, so another example we have over here is this image, and this image is really underexposed. So basically, if I go into the camera raw filter, look at this histogram. Everything is bundled up in to the left side, which means exceptionally underexposed. So the first step in this is, as you guessed it, black and white, and bring that exposure up, and look how much detail we were able to save from that. And now if I switch back to color, this is a completely different image. Just look at this. I don't have the words, you know. It's completely something else. From this, you know, just add some temperature, some colors like this. Now turn the highlights a little bit down. Bam, look at the difference. We started here. This is what we ended up with. If you really wanna take this up a bit, add some brush like this. So we've got some lights over there. And yep. So then again, we started from this, and this is the final result. Just a couple of clicks, and look at the difference. Another image is this one. And this is a really nice render actually, but it suffers from a couple of things. So first of all, it is really overexposed, especially in the forehead area. Actually, we can just go ahead and not talk about it and just do the talk. So as I said, black and white. This is really, so this is a kind of tricky one because this is well exposed, but the highlights are just too strong. So instead of playing with the exposure, I'm just gonna grab the highlights down and man, look at the difference this did. This is already looking a lot more natural and realistic. Alright, I've just done some quick adjustments to this image and I've got from this, which is pretty overexposed in areas like this, so the colors are burned, and because of this it also makes the entire skin and model look a little bit like plastic. So the post-processing also helps with that. So again, we went from this to this. So again, in the end, we had this, and now we've created this. And I think we can all agree that all the afters are looking a lot better than the original renders. And anyway, I think I've dragged this a bit too much for the video and for what I wanted to show you. I just wanted to make people understand that there's multiple tools that you can use in order to create one single final product. You don't want to limit yourself to Blender exclusively, so you don't have to do everything in there, you know. Just make sure that you are using everything that your computer puts at your disposal to create the perfect final product. And post-processing is the way to go about that. Not using post-processing is pretty much like being a photographer, taking pictures and then not going home and editing them in Lightroom or Photoshop. It's exactly like that with 3D renders. So films and filmmakers are using post-processing, doing color corrections and color grading in order to get a perfect look for the image, for their footage, and the same should be done by you and everyone else who's working in visual arts, digital visual arts. Anyway, this has been the tutorial. As I said, I've dragged this for too long, so I'm gonna speed up a lot of parts in here, but this is what I wanted to show you and talk about. And if you enjoyed the video, make sure to, subscribe, like, whatever you want to do with this, and I'll see you next week.